Welcome to Trashmagination, a podcast about reimagining trash. I'm Carla Brown. In today's episode, we'll talk about creative reuse of paper, and specifically envelopes, newspapers, magazines, and junk mail. So I have done a lot of past episodes about creatively reusing paper in its many forms. So if you like that topic, you should check out these past episodes. I did maps in episode 7, greeting and holiday cards in episode 66, books in episode 82, egg cartons in episode 83, tissue paper in episode 94, and my most popular episode of all time, cardboard tubes, in episode 97. So let's start by talking about what you need if you want to make homemade recycled paper. My favorite material to creatively reuse when I am making paper is colorful envelopes. They're already dyed many colors, and the quality of the paper is usually thick with strong fibers. They don't have a lot of writing on them, and you can cut out the parts that have the addresses and just not use those parts. And I also remove the flap that has glue on it. And I save pretty much any color of envelope except white or gray. If you don't receive many colorful envelopes, you could really use any paper that doesn't have a glossy sheen, it doesn't have much writing on it, or it comes in fun colors. You can also ask your friends to save their colorful envelopes. And then I've also used colorful file folders, although they're a little bit harder to rip up. The easiest envelopes to gather, of course, are manila envelopes. Those are the mustard yellow color envelopes. And if you're just starting out with paper making and would like to practice the process, or if you're teaching a lot of students about paper making, that is a great source of material. Another artist who loves to creatively reuse envelopes is Christine Tishio, who goes by the name Turnstile Art on social media. She makes collages where the entire thing is made from repurposed security envelopes. Now, those are the envelopes that have patterns on the inside, so you cannot see what is written on any of the papers inside the envelope. I don't know if you've ever looked inside a security envelope, but those patterns are often quite beautiful. So these envelopes are a great material to use because we often get mailed extra envelopes in the mail, and they're meant to be mailed back with your payment. But if you pay online, then you have these extra envelopes. Now, Christine will take those security envelopes and she makes collages of famous cartoon characters like The Simpsons. Then she actually lays them out with these little tiny cut up bits of security envelopes. So back to making paper. The first time I made paper, it was for an event called the Family Nature Summits, and I was going to be teaching kids how to make paper. So here's what I gathered so that I could teach that class other than envelopes. I gathered a blender, and the goal of the blender was to turn the envelopes into pulp. And then I gathered a medium-sized rectangular plastic container to hold the pulp watered down. And then I needed to make some frames. Now, if it was just me, I would make one frame, but I was teaching a bunch of kids, so I gathered little photo frames that I then would line with a screen or fabric, and I'll talk about how I did that. And then I made a presser, and the goal of the presser was to squeeze the excess water out of the sheets of paper as we made them. And then finally, I collected thin cloths or thin pieces of fabric. Now, to make the frames, I went to a hardware store and I got a window screen, like what you would put up on a screen door or on your window. And I cut the screen into rectangles that were a little bit larger than each of my wooden frames. And then I stretched the screen across the wooden frames and I stapled it down with a staple gun. To make my presser, I got 2 pieces of 1/2-inch plywood. Now, the 2 that I had were 12 by 24 inches. Now, the size, what you might make, would depend on the size of paper that you plan to make in the future. So I drilled holes in the 4 corners of the plywood so that those holes lined up across the 2 pieces, and then I put bolts in the holes. The idea was that each student would dip their frame into the watery pulp, and they would try to get a nice, even layer of pulp on their screen. And then they would put a thin cloth on the pulp and flip it so it came off their frame and we could use the frame for something else. And then we would layer the papers one on top of each other on that first piece of plywood in my presser with the cloth in between each piece of paper. So once we had a bunch of paper ready, we would put the second piece of plywood on top, and then we would tighten the bolts to press down on the paper and squeeze out the water. Now, my first paper making students were preschoolers, so I made 10 small frames that were just really tiny, 3 by 5 inches. Those are inexpensive frames that you can get at IKEA. And this was a good size for them to maneuver with their little hands, but it doesn't make a very useful piece of paper unless you are making something like miniature books. For adults, you likely want to get a bigger frame, maybe something 5 by 7 or 8 by 10. The dimensions of the paper they don't shrink that much as it dries. So before my students came to class, I made the pulp from the envelopes. I ripped up the envelopes into little shreds, and then, you could use scissors or a paper cutter to rip it up, but that actually damages the fibers. It's better if the paper rips naturally along where the fibers are and you don't cut any fibers in half. So as I said, I made most of the pulp before the students came, but when they came, of course, I also had them rip up some envelopes so they could see the process and they could understand where the pulp was coming from. Now, you don't need that much pulp to make a small project. That's because you're going to water down the pulp a lot and it's going to spread out. So once you've ripped up your paper into shreds, you put small quantities of it into your blender with water. So I would start with something like 1/4 cup of shreds and 3/4 of a cup of water. Depending on your blender, it should blend into something that kind of looks like a slush. If your blender gets stuck, like it won't keep blending, you just need to add more water. I can't exactly tell you the quantities, how much to put, because it depends on your shreds, it depends on your blender, so you're going to need to play around a little bit until you can get it to work. After you make your pulp, you're going to put maybe like 5 or 6 cups of water into that big rectangular container. And then you're going to add the pulp handful by handful into the water. Your goal is to water down the pulp. So how much pulp should you put? It depends. You're going to take some practice here, but you're going to put it in until it's a nice slushy, kind of watery slush. And that when you put the frames in, the pulp lies flat on the screen. At that point, you could add things like threads or tiny bits of fabric into the pulp. This will add texture to your paper and it can make the paper maybe a little bit stronger, but it also makes the paper bumpier. So it depends on what you're planning to do with your paper. You can also cut out shapes from paper to add to the pulp. So for example, this week on the Instagram account Run Lena Run, she was making Valentine's paper and she used a heart-shaped hole punch to punch out a whole bunch of tiny hearts. And she added those to her pulp and then those were embedded in her paper. And she calls this type of paper love letters. That Instagram account is a really great one if you're looking for paper making inspiration. When you're done making paper, you will have this container with sort of some watery pulp left over. So definitely you do not want to pour that down the sink or you could clog your plumbing. A better idea is to squeeze out as much of the water as you can from the pulp until it's a little ball of pulp. And then you can let that dry out and you can use it for your next paper making day. And you can just reconstitute it by adding water to it. Another thing that artists make from paper is clothing, and that may be a bit surprising, but let me explain. So you know that I love talking about trash fashion, and in previous episodes, I've talked about contests where people design clothing from recycled materials. So there are actually contests that specialize in clothing made from paper. 2 that I follow are the Paper Fashion Show, which takes place in Denver, Colorado, and one called Paper on Skin, which takes place in Tasmania, Australia. Now, both of these shows require designers to use mostly paper in their clothing designs. Now, when you look at the designs that have been featured in these contests, most of them are probably not made from recycled paper. But the designs can inspire those of us who prefer to use recycled materials. So once you have made paper from pulp, you will see that it could be a very useful material to make clothing because it can be dried in many shapes. It's easy to fasten it together and it's not expensive to get your materials. The Paper on Skin show is hosted in a town called Burnie, which is a place where they make paper as one of the main industries in that town. So it's really cool to see how the town built on its industrial history to encourage art making. Another way to creatively reuse paper for clothing design is by folding it. When I was first learning about trash fashion, I went to a trash fashion show at a town about 30 minutes from my house. And I was really impressed by so many designs, but there was one dress in particular that I really loved. And so after the show, I approached the 2 high school students who had made it, and I asked them, how did they do it? And they were really kind, and they even gave me a little sample of the material that they used to make their dress, which was, I think it was like ripped out of a calendar, and it had been folded many, many times back and forth with just a little fold peeking through, and then they taped it across the top. So this fragile paper was now quite a strong material. Plus, it had this cool effect of having the image folded over and over again, which now the image was not recognizable, but it was colorful. So many of the designs that you see at wearable art contests involve folding and are even inspired by complex origami. Next, let's talk about sculptors who make art from creatively reused paper, such as envelopes, newspapers, magazines, and junk mail. You can get inspiration to make your own sculptures by watching how they work. And I'm going to organize their stories by the techniques that they use to sculpt with paper. These first artists all roll their paper into tubes and then sculpt with it, similar to how you might sculpt long tubes of clay. Chie Hitotsuyama rolls wet newspaper and sculpts very realistic animal sculptures. The newspaper rolls look like yarn, which she places on the sculptures. She takes the sections of the paper that have colorful ink to add color to her sculptures as well, but most of her sculptures are kind of this gray color that you get from having black ink on white newspaper. Chie says that she likes to sculpt animals that have unusual shapes, like monkeys, or which seem like they should be too big to move, such as a rhinoceros. There are many videos of Chie sculpting, so I hope you can check them out in the show notes and you will understand her technique. It is amazing to see how much newspaper goes into one sculpture. She works with a team just to roll all the little rolls to make her sculptures. I mentioned earlier that the Paper on Skin contest originates in a town where they make paper, and Chie also grew up in a town where they make paper, which is called Fuji City in Japan. Her grandfather had a kumihimo factory. Kumihimo is a Japanese art of braiding, which usually involves threads, but Chie's grandfather did it with paper. So her art studio is now in the location where her grandfather's factory used to be. So clearly her grandfather's work making paper strings had a direct influence on her art today. Janie Crimmins rolls paper from junk mail to security envelopes to magazines. She makes them into these tiny rolls that look a little bit like beads, and then she lays them out in symmetrical shapes that are somewhat like mandalas, although some are spheres and some are random three-dimensional shapes. As I said, these little tubes look like beads, and her art looks like complex beadwork if you just looked at it at a glance. Eileen Payne also makes art from paper tubes. She makes bowls from magazine pages. First, she takes a magazine page and rolls it into a tube. She plans the color scheme of her bowls by laying the paper tubes beside each other. Then she joins the tubes together like a really long rope. And then she rolls this paper rope around itself, around, to form the center of the bowl and then the sides of the bowl, which she glues all together. And once the bowl is all rolled, she paints it with 5 layers of glue to make it strong and shiny. She also enjoys giving each bowl a fun name based on the color scheme and the papers that she used to make it. This method of rolling up magazine pages and then using them in art is a really accessible option for you to try, and it's really fun. If you check out my Pinterest board on magazines, you will see a lot of fun project ideas use this technique. But mostly it involves arranging the colorful tubes in an order that you like and gluing them into patterns that you like. So it's a very simple process and very achievable in a short period of time. Some people like to arrange the tubes in the letters of the alphabet, or maybe they make feathers. There is a classic creative reuse craft that reuses magazines to make beads. You cut the pages into very long triangles and then you roll them around a tiny dowel from the widest part of the triangle up to the point. So you glue the whole thing, you let it dry, and you slip it off the dowel, and now you have a little bead. The results can actually be quite spectacular if you roll things very carefully and you choose nice colors of magazine pages. So now let's shift gears away from artists who roll up paper into tubes and talk about artists who like to stack papers into enormous piles and then sculpt them. Miller Lagos takes thousands of newspapers and stacks them up very high. He will put screws inside those stacks to keep them from falling, and then he sculpts the outer edges of those stacks so the entire stack ends up looking like a giant tree. The heat from his sculpting tool faintly burns the paper, so the outer edge looks like tree bark. But if you lift up the layers, you will see it's still newspaper, just piled up on top of itself. David Mock has made installations with huge stacks of newspapers and other papers, and they look like big waves in the ocean. And then he incorporates giant objects into those waves, such as actual cars, trucks, boats, and pianos. And something that's a little bit mind-blowing is that he does not glue down the newspapers as he works, because he likes to keep moving them as he's sculpting. It seems rather precarious, but the way he designs it, it's an engineering feat. In one installation called Rock and Roll, there was 20,000 newspapers, just to give a sense of scale. So I hope you'll check out his works with these giant stacks of papers, and I'll be sure to be talking about him in future episodes. Another way that artists creatively reuse paper is using the technique called papier-mâché, which involves gluing strips of paper into a shape using a paste. So many artists use this technique. I'm not going to go into giving lots of examples, but one of my favorites is Abigail Brown. She makes very large masks and also really fanciful sculptures of animals. She has a very distinctive illustration style, and she makes all of her sculptures from recycled newspaper and then paints them. The last technique that I'm going to describe for creatively reusing paper is collages. And obviously, this is also extremely popular type of art. I'll mention a few that I think do something very unusual with collage. So Heidi Mraz lives quite close to me, and she has been a huge fan of classic and rare cars ever since she was 7 years old. She takes car magazines, car manuals, and even car schematics to make incredible collages of those cars. Her car collages are much appreciated by other car enthusiasts, and she's often commissioned to make the art for car events. She loves to incorporate details into the collage that tell the story of that car. On her website, it says that she has creatively reused more than 3,500 car magazines in her work so far. Manuela Granziol Fornera makes sculptures with many kinds of paper, but the sculpture I want to talk about now was made with magazines. So in 2018, Manuela built a structure out of cardboard of a young girl. She's sitting down, she has her knees up, she has her head tucked in her knees, she looks really sad. And the entire sculpture is covered with square cutouts from beauty magazines. So there's a great video that shows Manuela building this gigantic sculpture with a team, and it shows how she has a small scale model on the table and how then they're building this gigantic version in this huge studio space. Manuela has made other sculptures with magazines, like she made one called Drowning Point, where it's kind of like a whole outfit of clothing, but it's just made from magazine pages. And then she's also knitted photographs, and she made a sculpture out of her PhD thesis called 125,451 words. It is a cube that is 15 centimeters square with all the words cut up and rearranged. I bet lots of people would have imagined doing something similar with their thesis when they were done. So I'm going to finish by talking about Aurora Robson, who I've mentioned in episodes in the past. I'm a huge fan. She normally works with plastics. She also makes collages from junk mail. Similar to her plastic pieces, which are swooping, fluid sculptures, her collages are abstract pieces filled with curves. And just like with plastics, she transforms trash materials into something beautiful through artful cutting and arranging. She says she likes working with junk mail in her collages because they often contain language that is meant to convince you to do something. And that's a fun type of language to incorporate into art. I saw this video where she said one of the reasons she likes working with trash is because you can't make trash any worse than it is, so any artistry you put into it is an improvement. Wow, I love that mindset, and my super fandom for her work only grows ever more. So thank you for listening. I made a Pinterest board about creative reuse of paper and actually a separate one for creative reuse of magazines. Please let me know if you have ever creatively reused paper in unusual ways at trashmagination@gmail.com. And be sure to tell a friend about the podcast. Until next time, may you see recycled paper as a source of art in your life.